I had planned on doing a video about everything a beginner needs to know about container gardening, particularly filling the containers. That is the most important aspect of container gardening, in my opinion, is getting the container mix right. I was going to talk about all the different types of potting mix and various amendments, composts and manures and other things that you can use in container gardening, but I don't have time for that now. Hurricane's coming and I have a lot of work to do, and I kind of just need to get things done as quickly as possible. So I'm actually going to go ahead and fill all these pots so that they're weighed down before the storm comes so it doesn't blow them around. And I'm just going to do like a 2-minute update. I had planned like a 30-minute, very comprehensive video covering all the different aspects of, container mixes. But anyways, this is now going to be the abbreviated version. If you're filling containers, container choice is important. The best choice is clay. Clay pots are by far the superior choice for container gardening. Unfortunately, they're also expensive, they're heavy, sometimes they can be hard to find in larger sizes, and if they break, it's heartbreaking because they're so expensive. While clay is the best choice, I don't have a large percentage of my containers as clay for the reasons I just named. Second best choice is probably fabric pots. They're going to provide a lot of the same benefits of clay, such as root pruning, air root pruning that is. They're also very well draining, like clay pots are. They're not nearly as expensive. I think this clay pot here was probably like 18 bucks. These fabric pots that are the same size are about $3 to $4. They're not going to last quite as long as clay. They do break down after a couple seasons of intense moisture and UV and all that, but like I said, clay can actually crack, whereas these don't. So number one choice clay, number two choice fabric pots. Plastic isn't terrible if you get containers that are actually designed for planting. You can see this is the same size as the clay pot, whereas this was like 18 bucks. I want to say this was maybe $6, a little bit more than the fabric pots, not quite as much as the clay pots. These are fine if that's what you can find. Now we'll talk about some things not to use. Don't use buckets. There's a lot of beginners who like to use 5-gallon buckets, and I've done that before. I still have some of them in the garden. I think people like these things because they're so easy to find. They're cheap. They're usually $2.99 in any big box hardware store. You got to drill drainage holes in them, obviously. You can put them in the bottom or the sides. If this is all you can find, it's better than not growing your own food, but they're honestly a terrible choice because they break down after a year or two, and then you have shards of plastic all over the garden. And I'm sure y'all have seen from my previous videos, there's shards of plastic everywhere. You go to pick one of them up and it just crumbles. The other bad part about them is they're easily infested by certain types of weeds. So this was a bucket that I had a crop planted in last year, and the crop, I guess, finished or died or whatever, and the Bermuda grass worked its way into the drainage holes of the bucket. These were where the drainage holes were on the side. I think that other bucket had them in the bottom, but that's even worse. If you put drainage holes on the bottom, sometimes the pot won't drain well, the bucket rather, and it's very easy for grasses and other weeds to climb in there. This one had the drainage holes on the side, and the Bermuda grass still managed to get in there, and so now we just have a bucket of grass. And the other interesting thing about the buckets is it's not great for the roots of the plants. You can see how the roots just go in a complete circle and get all root bound. That's not really the best for absorbing nutrients and things. See how those roots are just all... That's not great. We talked about how fabric pots and clay pots provide air root pruning. So when the roots hit the edge, they don't wrap around, they get pruned off by the air, and then they're able to have more surface area to absorb all kinds of nutrients and things. Talk about container choice. Clay is the best. Fabric pots are the second best choice. Plastic is fine as long as it's meant for gardening. These tend not to break down in the sun like the buckets do. Buckets, terrible choice. If buckets are all you can find, get a cardboard box. You will be better off growing your crops in large cardboard boxes than you will buckets. Both of them will break down after a season or two, but cardboard just decomposes and feeds the soil, whereas plastic pollutes the soil. Microplastic pollution is a huge problem. It's also a big mess, it's hard to clean up, and it looks awful in the garden. Talked about a container choice, now we're going to talk about mixes. Always use a potting mix, not a garden soil. You'll see some people that, you know, try to fill containers with a garden soil because it's cheaper. It gets all compacted, the plants don't do well. Make sure it's a potting mix. I do everything on the cheap, so I tend to buy some of the cheapest potting mixes I can find. This huge bag here is only like $7 or $8. It's 2 cubic feet, and I like this company a lot. They donate like proceeds to wildlife conservation. It's very affordable, but it's a pretty high quality mix in my opinion. There's a lot of different brands of potting mix. Some of them put synthetic fertilizers in there, some of them put all kinds of additives. The general ingredients you will find in a potting mix are going to be things like forest products, peat moss, perlite, maybe some vermiculite, maybe some sand, maybe some humus. You can generally tell the quality of a potting mix based on the order in which those ingredients come. If the potting mix is primarily forest products and sand, it's a very low quality potting mix. If it has a larger percentage of things like peat moss and perlite, it's usually a higher quality potting mix. Like I said, this is my favorite brand, but if that brand isn't near you, everybody's got an Ace Hardware near them. This says potting soil, which is technically incorrect. It's a potting mix. They accidentally put soil on here because I guess they don't have geologists doing the marketing. Soils are things like sand, silts, clays, and other things. While there may be a tiny bit of sand in some potting mixes, this potting mix I don't think actually has any sand at all. It's overwhelmingly ironic to call this a soil because it doesn't contain any soil, which is okay. You don't have to have soil in containers. If you want to throw a little bit of native soil from your ground into your containers to add, you know, bacteria and other microbes, that's fine. But the idea of, you know, just digging up a bunch of soil and putting it in a container is usually asking for compaction. So you can see it's labeled for potted plants, and if we look at the ingredients, it's got peat humus as the first ingredient, so we know this is a high quality potting mix. Composted forest products is the second ingredient. Perlite, oh, it does have a tiny bit of sand. It's still not a soil though. The fact that it has a little bit of sand doesn't make it a soil. This one I think has very similar ingredients. It's got a little bit more perlite in it, and I think this one does actually have a tiny bit of some synthetic fertilizer in there, not a big deal. So you can go straight potting mix if you want to. If that's all you have, you can fill your containers with straight potting mix. I prefer to do a blend of potting mix and compost. I usually do half and half. I've done straight compost before too, but sometimes that can be a little bit too soggy and you'll get things like root rots. Straight compost doesn't always drain really well, especially like some of your heavier composts like cow manure. So yeah, I'm gonna finish filling all these containers. The other rule of thumb I was gonna mention is that the smaller the container, the more important it is to use high quality mixes. If you're filling a huge container, something that's like 30 or 40 gallons, it's going to be very expensive to fill it with high quality potting mixes, and it's also less necessary. The bigger the container is, generally the larger, more vigorous plant you're going to have in there. It can handle some lower quality soils, or mixes rather. So things for compost that I use, if you have homemade compost, that's probably one of the best things to add. I have trouble, you know, making homemade compost because I have so many wildlife issues, so I tend to do more like chop and drop type of composting as opposed to, you know, actually making a nice compost that I can shovel into containers. But there are some local farms near me that do some really nice composts. So my favorite compost to use is this organic chicken manure green compost. This is basically just a mixture of chicken manure and green materials. It's phenomenal. It comes from a local farm near me, very affordable. I think this bag is like maybe $5. This is one of my favorite composts to use. When I can afford it, I'll also get this other local compost that's called Mater Maker. Comes from the upstate. I want to say that I like this a little bit more than the chicken one, simply because it's finer. The material has been, I guess, sieved to a smaller particle size. This doesn't have chicken manure in it. This has mostly fish, some cow manure, and composted plant material. It doesn't sound like, you know, amazing ingredients. The fish is obviously really high quality, but whatever they do to this, they get it like so incredibly fine. It's almost like a seeding type of mix. You know, I direct seed into this. I can fill seed trays with this, and it's just extremely fine. but very expensive. This small bag here, I want to say, is like $9. I also use some mushroom compost. I can get this from big box hardware store. Phenomenal ingredient. Again, very, very fine. Seed to a very small particle size. I can also use that as a seeding medium. I can fill seed trays with that. It's much cheaper than the local stuff here. Mushroom compost is very interesting. You know, it's got a lot of micronutrients in it. Mushrooms don't tend to be very heavy feeders, and mushroom farmers were kind of on the cutting edge of, you know, doing things organically and naturally before it got, you know, more popular with modern farmers. Mushroom farmers tend to be very responsible and environmentally conscious, and their products are always great. I also use some of this cow manure. I'm not sure why I keep buying this. It's a little expensive. This bag was maybe $6 or $7. They say it feeds your plants all for 3 months. I don't know quite about that. It's pretty light. It's a 0.5. Like I said, I don't know why I keep using this. I think because I enjoy having a lot of different ingredients. I think that a container mix and even filling a raised bed is going to be better when you have a lot of different things. If you fill it with all one thing, you're just getting what that one thing offers. So in terms of getting a good, you know, balance and all different types of microbes in there, I like to add as many different things as I can. So when I'm filling these containers today, the smaller ones, the ones that are really tiny, like these 3-gallon pots here, because they're so small, it's important that I fill them with the highest quality ingredients. So these here are gonna get probably half potting mix, and then they're gonna get a bunch of this really nice expensive stuff like the Mater Maker and a bunch of the chicken manure. A little bit of mushroom compost in there too. The medium-sized containers, again, they're still gonna get half potting mix, but I'm gonna use maybe more mushroom compost and some of the black cow. And then the biggest containers, these ones that are 10 gallons, because those are more expensive to fill, they're gonna get half potting mix and then mostly cheaper things like black cow, and I guess the mushroom compost is pretty inexpensive too. So yeah, the smaller the container, the more important it is that your potting mix be extremely high quality. Bigger container, you can get away with using, you know, more of the cheaper stuff. In terms of amendments, yes, some potting mixes do contain a small amount of fertilizer, and yes, some of your compost will provide some fertility. It's not usually enough for heavy feeding crops. If you're just doing stuff like, you know, herbs and lettuce and greens, the straight potting mix is probably fine. But if you're doing heavy feeders like, you know, tomatoes and squash and other things that are going to take a lot of, you know, nutrients out of the ground, or out of your container rather, it is important to add a couple things. Oh, I put the sodium nitrate in the house because it was raining. Everybody knows what sodium nitrate, Chilean nitrate is, hopefully. I don't have to show it necessarily. I got a couple different bone meals here. I'm not sure why they're so vastly different in terms of their NPK composition. This one here is really, really hot. It's a 125.0, and it's organic. That's pretty hot, 125. The 25 rather, not the 1. This one here is a little bit lighter. I want to say this was like this is a 214.0. Not sure why this one has so much more than this one when they're both organic bone meal. But anyway, that's going to be more important for fruiting crops. Things like tomatoes and peppers are going to want more of the bone meal than they do the sodium nitrate. Things like squash and corn, you're going to want more of the nitrate. Some people throw a little bit of Epsom salt in there for magnesium and sulfur. There's a lot of people out there who swear by Epsom salts for tomatoes and peppers, and there's all kinds of ridiculous claims about how it prevents blossom end rot. That's not actually true. But magnesium and sulfur are important plant micronutrients. They're not plant macronutrients. They're not, you know, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, but they are important micronutrients. Very rarely will a plant that's in the ground actually be deficient in magnesium and sulfur. But, you know, if you're growing peppers and tomatoes in containers and you want to throw some Epsom salt in there, it's not going to hurt anything. And it's cheap enough that it doesn't really matter whether or not it provides tons of benefits. It's not going to hurt you to throw it in there. Maybe it provides some small benefits. Go ahead and throw some in there if you want to. There's also super expensive potting mixes. I forgot to mention these. This company is probably making money hand over fist. This is actually a sterilized potting mix, so it's cool if you're, you know, doing indoor stuff and you don't want any bugs or, you know, diseases or anything like that. There's also no beneficial microbes in something like this, so that's why they go and inoculate it with a mycorrhiza fungi. So they sterilize it and then they put some of the fungi back in there. This stuff is stupid expensive. I would never recommend buying anything that expensive. It's easily 5 times the price of any other potting mix, and it doesn't provide anything more. It's just, again, it's sterilized and it's incredibly fine. It's a decent seeding medium, but we also talked about how you can use things like mushroom compost and other really well sieved composts as seeding type media. So I wouldn't recommend buying all the super expensive stuff. You'll see, you know, if you go to the big box store, you'll see 15 different brands of potting mix, and a lot of them are just expensive for no reason. Go ahead and just buy, you know, standard potting mix and add a little bit of extra fertilizer to it if you feel you need to. So yeah, that kind of sums up the video. Container choice: clay is the best. Fabric pot, second best choice. Plastic is okay if it's meant for gardening. Don't use buckets. They're awful and they break down and get plastic everywhere. If all you can find is buckets, find you a cardboard box. You're better off growing in a cardboard box than you are a plastic bucket. Containers, container mixes. Use potting mix. Don't use garden soil. Take your potting mix, amend it with some compost if you have it, and your containers will do really well for you. Thank y'all for tuning in. Sorry it's not the super thorough garden update on container mixes that I meant to do. I get a lot of questions from beginners, especially during these uncertain times. A lot of people are, you know, in apartments and in places where they don't have access to raised beds and in-ground gardening, and they say, well, how can I grow my food in containers? You can grow a ton of food in containers. Get you some big fabric pots, 10-gallon fabric pots, 15-gallon fabric pots. I have some 20, 30, 40, 50-gallon fabric pots. They almost act like raised beds at that point. If you have a 40 or 50-gallon fabric pot and you fill it with nice potting mix and compost, that's going to be more productive than probably any raised bed you'll ever see. So yeah, you can grow a ton of food in containers. Just make sure to get your container mixes right. So yeah, if y'all have any more questions, feel free to comment or email me.